Cold, eerie, and spine-chilling, a mysterious side at night will soon be revealed to you. Behind its dark walls lie haunting tales that will send shivers down your spine. When I was about 16 years old, my parents would occasionally leave me at my grandmother's house for the weekend. They cherished their rare nights out, dinners, shows, and time alone without worrying about me tagging along. For me, these weekends were bittersweet. Nana's house was old, creaky, and seemed to be perpetually shrouded in shadows, even on sunny days. But despite its eerie ambiance, it was a place filled with memories. I always stayed in the same room, the spare bedroom at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The air in that room was thick, almost suffocating, and no matter how many blankets I piled on, it never seemed to get warm. The room was modestly furnished, an old wooden bed that groaned with every movement, a rickety chair that stood in the corner, and the most peculiar item, a large oval picture frame that hung directly across from the bed. Inside that frame was a painting that had always fascinated me. It depicted a whimsical yet strangely unsettling scene of woodland creatures floating down a gentle stream on a makeshift raft. But what always caught my eye was the turtle, the only creature that seemed to be struggling. While the other animals sat leisurely on the raft, the turtle was depicted tugging on a thick rope, pulling the raft upstream. I couldn't help but feel pity for it. The detail was almost lifelike, and I would often get lost staring at it before falling asleep. I wondered why the artist had chosen to portray the turtle in such a way. It seemed almost cruel. The turtle, with its tiny legs and determined expression, seemed to bear the burden of everyone else's comfort. Many nights I would whisper to it softly, "I'm sorry you have to work so hard." It was a silly thing to do, but it became a sort of ritual, a way to soothe myself to sleep. But one weekend, everything changed. That evening felt off from the very beginning. The air was dense, almost suffocating, and an eerie silence hung over the house. Nana had gone to bed unusually early, leaving me alone in the living room. I felt a strange sense of unease, like I was being watched, though I couldn't pinpoint from where. Finally, I decided to head to bed. As I lay there, staring at the painting as I always did, a chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. The turtle was no longer pulling the rope. Instead, it had climbed onto the raft, standing upright among the other creatures. Its eyes were fixed directly on me, a twisted grin spread across its face. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of my tired mind, but when I looked again, nothing had changed. The turtle was still there, waving at me, its grin widening. Panic surged through me, and I leapt out of bed, rushing down the hallway to wake my Nana. I could barely get the words out, trying to explain what I had seen. Her reaction was strangely cold. She looked at the painting with a dull, almost lifeless expression and simply said, "It's always been like that, dear. The turtle has always been on the raft." I was stunned. I knew she was wrong. I had spent countless nights staring at that painting, and the turtle was always pulling the rope. I pleaded with her to look again, but she just shook her head and returned to bed, muttering something about me needing more sleep. I was left alone, standing in the dark hallway, with the feeling that something in the house had shifted. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding. I returned to the bedroom, heart pounding, and stared at the painting again. The turtle's eyes seemed to follow me, gleaming in the faint moonlight. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel those eyes watching me. The sensation was unbearable. I buried my face under the pillow, trying to block out the feeling, but it only grew stronger. Then, just as I was on the edge of exhaustion, I heard it, a low, wet, dragging sound coming from somewhere in the room. At first it was faint, like something heavy being dragged across the floorboards. Then it grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to be right next to my bed. My hands shook as I reached for the bedside lamp, But just as my fingers brushed against the switch, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was so intense, it was almost deafening. Summoning all my courage, I turned my head and nearly screamed. The old wooden chair, which had always been tucked away in the corner, was now directly facing my bed, its legs leaving dark, wet streaks on the floor. The next morning, I tried once more to convince Nana, but it was like she was in a trance. Her eyes were hollow, her responses monotone. "The painting never changes," she kept repeating. "You must be tired." My parents arrived to pick me up, and I begged them to take a look, but to my horror, the painting had returned to normal. The turtle was once again pulling the rope, its expression innocent. My parents laughed it off, saying I was just imagining things, but the turtle's eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, still seemed to follow me as we walked out. Years passed, and I avoided Nana's house as much as I could. But then, a few months ago, I received the call. Nana had passed away peacefully, or so they said. We gathered at her house one last time before it was sold. I hesitated at the threshold, memories flooding back, but eventually I found myself standing before that spare room once more. The painting was still there, hanging ominously on the wall, but the glass was shattered and the image inside was distorted, as though something had tried to break free. The turtle was gone entirely, leaving behind a black smear that dripped slowly, staining the frame. As I turned to leave, a whisper, cold and menacing, brushed against my ear. "Thank you for letting me out." I ran from the house, the sound of wet dragging following me down the hall, through the front door, and out into the cold night air. The nightmare that had haunted me for years was far from over. I could feel its presence, lurking, watching, waiting. Now that cursed painting hangs in my parents' house, and every time I visit, I can feel the turtle's gaze piercing through me. It's waiting for another chance to escape, for someone else to notice that it has moved again. It was the night before Halloween, a night thick with an unsettling chill that seemed to creep through our jackets and settle deep into our bones. My friends and I, a group of 6, decided we would do something truly daring. The idea was simple but spine-chilling: a midnight trip to the graveyard. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves as we walked through the narrow, winding path leading to the cemetery. The moon was hidden behind dark, ominous clouds, casting the world in a murky silver light. The graveyard was eerily silent. Only the occasional hoot of an owl broke the stillness. We made our way to the center of the cemetery, where the oldest graves lay, their headstones cracked and covered in ivy. The air grew colder the deeper we went, as if we were stepping into another world entirely. A fog began to roll in, clinging to our ankles like spectral fingers. Someone in our group suggested we make the night even more terrifying by using a Ouija board. At first, we laughed it off, but the idea was too tempting to resist. We found a flat tombstone, brushed away the dried leaves, and placed the board on it. We surrounded it with black and white candles, the flames flickering in the cold night breeze, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The planchette was placed on the board, and we all put our fingers on it hesitantly. We asked the usual questions at first. "Is there anyone here? Can you give us a sign?" But received only silence. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches creak like the bones of long-forgotten corpses. Then, feeling bold, my friend Tim asked, "Can we see a spirit in this graveyard?" For a moment, nothing happened. But then, slowly, the planchette began to move. We all stared in disbelief as the planchette slid across the board, finally landing on yes. A shiver went down my spine, and the air around us seemed to grow even colder. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a dark blur moving through the mist. It seemed to hover at first, like a shadow detached from any form. The blur began to shift, solidifying into the shape of an old woman. Her hair was long, tangled and gray, flowing around her like wisps of smoke. The woman's face was wrinkled and sunken, her eyes two black pits that seemed to devour the light. We froze in terror, barely able to breathe as the figure slowly moved toward us. The smell of decay filled the air, an odor so foul it made my stomach churn. Two of the girls in our group, Lisa and Megan, couldn't take it. They screamed, turned, and ran back down the path toward the gate. The rest of us, Tim, David, Sarah, and I, were paralyzed with fear but also an inexplicable curiosity. The old woman's gaze seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto us. Without warning, she turned and began to shuffle away into the shadows, disappearing into the thick mist. For a moment, we were relieved, thinking she was gone. But just as we began to relax, the planchette on the Ouija board flew into the air, spinning violently before shooting across the graveyard. It crashed down with a heavy thud onto a nearby grave. We cautiously approached the grave where the planchette had landed. The tombstone was ancient, the inscriptions almost eroded by time, but we could still make out the name and dates. February 16, 1810, April 21, 1885. Beneath it was a faded, ghostly image of the very same old woman we had just seen. A chill swept over us as we realized we had somehow summoned her from her eternal rest. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and a low, guttural growl echoed around us. "We're so sorry," Sarah stammered, her voice trembling, but there was no response, just an oppressive silence. Then a cold, spectral voice hissed through the darkness. "You disturbed my rest, and now you must pay." The words were like a knife to my soul, cutting through me with a cold so intense it was painful. Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to tremble. Cracks formed in the earth like skeletal hands trying to break free. I could hear a faint whispering all around, voices too soft to understand but filled with malice. The fog thickened, swirling around us like a living entity. It was as if the graveyard had come alive, feeding on our fear. Tim turned to run, but the old woman's ghostly figure reappeared, blocking his path. Her eyes were glowing a sickly yellow now, her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin that split her face almost in half. With a shriek that pierced the night, she lunged at him. Tim stumbled back, but it was as if an invisible force held him in place. His eyes rolled back, and he let out a scream that was abruptly cut off. David grabbed my arm, pulling me away, shouting that we needed to leave. But as we turned, the gravestones around us began to shift, their inscriptions changing before our eyes to show our own names and today's date. The sheer horror of it nearly paralyzed me, but somehow I managed to break free of the terror long enough to drag Sarah along with us as we fled toward the cemetery gate. We heard Tim's screams fading behind us, followed by an eerie silence. I wanted to go back for him, but David shouted, "We can't help him now. We have to go." As we reached the gate, the sound of dragging footsteps and labored breathing echoed behind us. I dared to look back one last time and saw the old woman standing over Tim's lifeless body, her skeletal fingers reaching down as if to draw the last remnants of his soul. We burst through the cemetery gates, gasping for breath. The old woman's spectral figure was still visible in the distance, her form slowly dissolving back into the mist. Sarah was sobbing uncontrollably, and David was whispering prayers under his breath. But even as we reached the safety of the streetlights, the feeling of being watched never left me. It was as if her eyes were still upon us, waiting for the moment we would dare to return. We made a pact that night. We would never speak of what happened, but the nightmares have never stopped. Every year, as Halloween approaches, I hear her voice in my dreams, whispering from the darkness, "You will come back. You belong with me." Sometimes, I find muddy footprints near my window, and the smell of decay fills my room. And every time I pass by the old graveyard, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere among those graves, the old woman is still waiting for us to return. This story actually happened to my father when he was young. At that time, he lived with his parents and brothers in an old, decrepit apartment building. The building had many units, and the atmosphere was always damp and cold, even during the summer. On the top floor where the laundry area was located, there was always an eerie atmosphere lingering. The old washboards were covered in moss, and the dark, damp corners always made the children in the building uneasy. On that top floor lived a very old woman with hair as white as snow. She always wore the same old black clothing, as if she had been wearing it for decades. She spent her days washing clothes, the creaking sound of the washboard echoing down to the lower floors whenever she worked. It was said that she never left the rooftop, and her sunken eyes always gleamed with something strange, sending chills down the spine of anyone who met her. One day, everything changed abruptly. The old woman passed away naturally, though no one knew the exact cause. Her apartment on the top floor was abandoned, and no one dared to go up there anymore. The air on the rooftop became gloomier than ever, as if her death had left a curse on that place. A few days after the old woman's death, my father and his best friend, named Mark, decided to go up to the rooftop to explore. They thought it would just be a fun adventure for curious teenagers. However, as they got closer to the top floor, the air became more stifling and unnaturally cold, as if something invisible was watching them. That night, the sky was pitch black, and the moonlight barely peeked through the thick clouds, making everything even more ominous. My father and Mark slowly climbed the final steps, their hearts pounding in their chests. The rooftop was shrouded in an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks, creating a haunting whisper-like sound. They approached the area where the old washboards were, where the old lady used to stand washing her clothes. Just as they were about to turn around and leave, my father noticed that Mark's face had turned ashen. Mark's eyes were wide open, and his mouth trembled, as if trying to say something but failing to form the words. A chilling gust of wind blew past them, and my father suddenly felt a haunting presence right behind him. Slowly, my father turned around, and the sight before him made his blood run cold. The old lady was standing there, suspended in midair, floating just inches above the ground. Her long white hair drifted around her like it was being blown by an invisible wind, even though the air was deathly still. Her eyes, black as bottomless pits, were staring straight into their souls. The old woman began to turn slowly, her movements unnaturally fluid, as if she were underwater. From the corner of her mouth, a dry, raspy laugh echoed through the air, the sound like nails scratching on a chalkboard, sending shivers down their spines. The laughter reverberated, lingering in the air as though it came from the depths of the underworld. When she finally turned to face them fully, her face began to twist and distort. Her wrinkled skin started to tear, revealing decaying flesh beneath. Her hollow eyes emitted a sickly green light, boring into my father's and Mark's minds. Mark tried to scream, but the sound seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness surrounding them. Without warning, the old woman reached out towards my father. Her skeletal hands extended unnaturally long, as if trying to grasp his very soul. Mark, who had completely lost his nerve, collapsed to the ground, screaming for mercy. My father tried to pull Mark to his feet, but the icy touch of the old woman's fingers brushed against his shoulder, freezing him in place. In that moment, my father heard a whispering voice behind him. "You disturbed my rest." The voice was like a whisper from the grave, making him feel as though the blood in his veins was turning to ice. The old woman slowly moved closer, and the stench of decay hit his nostrils, so overpowering that he nearly retched. Suddenly, the dim light on the rooftop flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced around them. In the flickering light, my father watched as the old woman gradually faded into the darkness, as if she were being sucked into a bottomless void. But before disappearing completely, her eyes flared with a look of pure hatred. as if sending a curse their way. My father and Mark didn't hesitate any longer. They turned and bolted down the stairs, their hearts pounding in their chests like war drums. It felt as if a deathly chill was chasing them, as though the old woman was still pursuing them. Every footstep echoed like the pounding heartbeat of a monster hunting its prey. When they finally burst out of the building, they almost collapsed from exhaustion. They gasped for air, collapsing onto the sidewalk. Mark couldn't speak, only sitting there trembling like a leaf in a storm. My father whispered that they would never go back to that rooftop again, and they kept their promise. But from that night on, my father was haunted by the image of the old woman with those hollow, soulless eyes. Every night, as darkness fell, he would hear faint whispering, as though it came from far away. "I will return. I am waiting for you." And on some nights, he would find wet footprints on the floor, leading toward the dark staircase. Could it be a warning that the old woman had not forgiven them?